Welcome back, everybody, to the Bible Search and Rescue podcast. Bible Search and Rescue is part of the West-R Institute. West-R is all about helping people understand religious literacy and bringing religious literacy into the public. And if we're talking about religious literacy, and ways of helping people understand religious literacy, I can think of no better guest today than to have our very own executive director, Dr. David Galston. So, David is a remarkable guy. He's a humanitarian, philanthropist, all world human being, as well as being the executive director of the West-R Institute. And today we're having David on because we're going to talk about his book, Restoring Humanism to Religion: Why Religiousness Matters More Than Belief. So, did I get that name right, David? Did I nail it?
Yes, you did, Brad.
Boom. All
Excellent.
right. Yes,
Better than
yes.
I could do, that's for sure.
Oh, no, no, no. But great book. And it serves as kind of a fascinating reflection on religion, authoritarianism, the social gospel. So we're going to jump in today. But first of all, David, how are you doing?
Well, I'm fine. Westar as an institute is growing, and we are expanding the different types of issues that we address. So this book
Hmm.
reflects some of the Westar expanse that has happened over the last 5 years, going into different areas: philosophy, theology, biblical studies, and to some degree sociology and anthropology. So it's quite interesting to be in the position I'm in terms of the Westar and its growth and development. And I'm doing fine.
Absolutely. No, and you are an absolutely essential part of that because Westar, for those who are not as familiar with our background, Westar really launched because of the Jesus seminar in the 1980s. So looking at Jesus as a historical figure, which for a lot of people, pursuing Jesus as a historical figure, if it means anything beyond just accepting everything written in the New Testament, we don't want to go there. We just want to accept the Jesus of the New Testament and all of the books, no matter whether it's contradictory or not, as being perfectly all in alignment. Which leads into a bit of what we're going to be talking about today. Because as David and Westar have expanded this vision of what it means to look at religion, to deal with issues of Christian nationalism, and all of these other areas we've had to jump into, which is part of religious literacy today, David's exploration of restoring humanism to religion actually was born out of a lecture that he gave. So let's kind of start there, David, and think about what was your lecture about and how did it expand?
Yeah, the lecture originally was about the death of God, just that philosophy. And it was named The Death of God and the Future of Religion. So I went through the part that's now the chapter on David Hume and uh, Hegel and Marx and Feuerbach and Freud, I think, and Jung. I had all of those characters sort of reviewed, indicating why this death of God movement kind of started. What are the foundations of it? Of course, the main character being Nietzsche. So um, once I did that philosophical stuff, I kind of said, what's the future of religion? Does it have a value for humanity beyond these sort of assumed beliefs?
Hmm.
And I, at that time, I did not use the word religiousness, which appears in the text, but I did try to talk about religion still has a kind of a human value because it offers these relational uh, symbols or relational language,
Hmm.
rituals, and of course with the historical Jesus, aphorisms and interesting parables and literary history. So all religions have these kinds of elements, and they can be valued as part of our history and valued as part of our human structure or human self, if you like.
Hmm.
And So you can't just dismiss all that. It is a certain content of value, but the three-tiered universe and the assumed God language referring to a divine being, etc. This really has become untenable since about the 19th century. So it raises the question what to do with religion. That was my original lecture.
All right, so let's jump into this because anytime you refer to death of God, people are upset, they're angry, you're just a Christian hater, right? Those types of things.
Right.
So let's instead of just allowing people. And by the way, this will be a good test to see who actually listens to the podcast and who just sees a reference to death of God in the title and leaves a nasty comment. Let's actually jump into this. What does the death of God actually mean, as opposed to the knee-jerk reaction that one typically gets from the Christian right?
Yeah, so there's two kind of elements to the death of God, and one is the passing of the ancient universe, that we do not live in a three-tiered universe anymore. So there is no God upstairs. That's kind of the obvious part of it. But the death of God is, though, more radical than that. It's also the descent of the old God, if you like, the old gods who lived up on the mountains, into his history. So it's very much like Hegel's philosophy that God, or the idea of spirituality, really descends into history. It becomes the dynamic and the movement of history, and in some ways, the responsibility of humanity on the earth. We have to become, if you like, agents of respectful relationships, agents of divinity. And that, so it's the death of God in that sense of nobody's going to help us. We're not going to be bailed out of history.
Hmm.
But it's in some ways a new kind of human spirituality at the same time. So people get shocked about the title "Death of God." Well, obviously you're an atheist, but they don't see the spirituality, the side of spirituality in that phrase, which is probably more important than the shock value of just saying the death of God. I think the expression is to bring attention to what's going on. And same with my book title, Restoring Humanism to Religion. There's a bit of a shock value in the sense that I wanted to say, hey, religions wake up. And, humanism isn't anti-religion,
Mhm.
but we tend to regard humanism and religion as opposites, and they're not. They're not opposites at all.
Well, especially when we consider that religion emanates out of humanism, right? Because when we realize that there is no, the tablets aren't falling from the sky. Whenever we look at the realities that deities throughout history have tended to look an awful lot like the societies that cultivate these deities, one begins to understand that. And I think, kind of to your point, it hits towards modern audiences. If you were to say the death of Zeus as an idea that most people do not accept that Zeus was a literal figure living on top of Olympus
Right.
anymore, people would have no problem accepting that. But you make it about the God of the Bible, and all of a sudden that's offensive. It's okay if that other deity dies or these other deities around the globe dies. But if our Western concept of the Christian God dies, that's a different thing. So can you touch on that a little bit and what the reasons are for the idea of the death of God?
I'll try. Um, it's a bit strange because part of what's wrapped up in that is the fear that if you don't have a God, an authoritarian up in the sky on the mountain, or above the clouds or wherever God is, you will have social chaos.
Hmm.
There's no being who's going to regulate human morality. But that is very deceiving because societies that are the least religious are far more moral than societies that are the most religious. And why is that? Because the societies that are least religious are the least authoritarian. So where does the responsibility of ethics fall? It falls into the human lap. It falls into human relationships. So in fact, strangely, without God, we're more moral. because we have more consciousness of our life depending upon other people and living with other people in peace. So we
Hmm.
don't actually fall into chaos. This is the historic worry about the loss of religion will mean chaos and everybody will just live on their own and all against each other. This is kind of the Thomas Hobbes view that I think is in that book.
Hmm.
It's funny, you forget what you've written sometimes, but yeah, I
Yes.
make a reference to Thomas Hobbes and his great fear, even though he personally was an agnostic, his great fear that if there wasn't religion, there wouldn't be the possibility of having an ordered society. But I think that's been proven wrong, not just wrong, it's the opposite.
Hmm.
So there's that kind of shock value. But the other point I think really significant is what do you mean when you don't have religion, you actually have a more caring society? Well, this is exactly what the death of God means. The Spirit of God, the old God, descends into history, descends into our humanity, into our human spirit, and God is in fact becoming the care we have for one another, the interrelationship of all human beings and our relation to nature. So that is ethics. And in the
Hmm.
end, that's what religion is about. In the end, that is the humanism of religion. The care, the love, the compassion, the sense of responsibility. These are all the humanist elements, if you like, of religion. And it's not that religion never had these things. If you go back to the birth of Christianity or go back into ancient Judaism or into the ancient Roman and ancient Greece, you see these qualities, they're there. They're
Hmm.
always there in the religions as the religions go forward. They're always there. I mean, you cannot deny the Amos, for example, the prophet Amos in the Bible is absolutely the voice of justice, is the voice of Judaism as the voice of justice. It's a very humanist voice. In that book, God doesn't care at all about religion. God wants justice. That's very clear in Amos. And that's not untypical of religions, the way religions carry humanism within their hearts.
Hmm.
And what's happened since Christian fundamentalism is that we've made humanism the enemy. And that's not really true in Christian history. Humanism is the enemy of religion, or is somehow atheism, or is evil, or is chaotic, or doesn't believe anything. None of that's true. It's just all name calling.
Yeah. It's the propaganda, right? That to me has always been one of the remarkable things about the idea that if we don't have this idea of God sitting above us, we're just going to descend into immorality.
Right.
Well, the world was not just descent into chaos, just everyone killing each other until the Christian world came along, and then everything went into this utopia of peace. Quite the opposite. What we have seen, as you're talking about, the death of God and the reality of God as being a centerpiece of authoritarianism
Mhm.
and utilizing that authoritarianism against others. And to kind of build on that, you're talking about the idea of morals and ethics. For those in the Christian world, especially today, who pretend like morals and ethics are some fixed point within Scripture, no, they're not. They never have been. What Christians have considered to be moral and ethical has changed dramatically over 2 millennia, including in up to the co-opting of government power, the killing of witches, inquisitions, anti-Semitism, slavery, the slavery that Christians in the United States propagated through the use of Scripture. And yet today, you would probably have any number of Christians, fundamentalists, who would say, oh, no, 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 we don't consider slavery moral. And yet slavery is codified within the Torah. And so what you're hitting on hits at the very heart of that sense of literalism and what happens when we take literalism. And you talk about how literalism can only be propagated by ignoring science. And I think this is an important point. Can you hit on that for us a little bit?
Yes. So, when you do the complicated kind of historic question of the death of God and the sort of academic arguments that existed in the 18th and 19th century, you find that these arguments have kind of filtered over into common everyday life in the 20th and 21st century. And these are expressed in these simple things that you can encounter, as I say, in coffee shops for myself, just sitting down in a coffee shop and talking or listening to people talk. You hear these arguments that are, more complicated, I guess, or expressed in a more complicated way from a few hundred years ago, being in everyday language.
Hmm.
And one of them is the contradiction between science and religion. As you are noting, that the more we understand the universe is not a three-tiered universe, and that's a common understanding now, the less we can create room, narrative room for speech, understanding, or ideas that depend on that three-tiered universe that doesn't exist. So they become nonsense. So creation science is nonsense. To most people, it's nonsense. But it happens because you take it literally and you try to force it into a scientific theory. And of course, you look at that from the point of view of evolution and cosmology, and you just can see plainly people are making stuff up. They're
Hmm.
making it up because they're trying to protect the authority of the Bible, as if truth has to be science, and so the Bible has to be science. It's and so that's a loss of humanism. Because remember,
Hmm.
humanism is about the arts. It was born in the Renaissance. It's about humanities.
Hmm.
And there's a totally different way of understanding the Bible that kind of gets silenced or sidetracked or is just not heard because of the noise of literalism
Hmm.
trying to make an ancient myth into modern science. And it's just the craziest act
Hmm.
around. And more, it's impossible to approach the Bible as art because the noise is that it has to be science, and that's just pure nonsense.
Yeah.
So God continues to die.
Yeah. Well, and people like what you're driving at here is that there are people who are looking at this and going, well, obviously the Earth is not 5 or 6 thousand years old, right? We
Yes.
know that. That's fact. It's
Yeah.
not, and despite the fact that there's any number of people who may stumble across this and who will rant and rave and get angry about that, that is what every scientific reality faces. And once again, going back to that comparative sense, if we were to call an Egyptian creation myth, just that it was myth and it should not be taken literally, the same folks who are so insistent on Genesis being absolute historical and scientific fact would not have a problem with that. It comes to this one book. No, no, this one's different. There's this biblical exceptionalism in all situations. Our biblical texts are exceptional to everything else. Therefore, they get to play by their own rules. And if any piece of scientific or archaeological data does not jive with that, then the scientific and archaeological data must be wrong. Every other field is wrong, and we're right because the book says it, and that's all that matters.
The other odd thing about that is that in fundamentalist Christianity, they that movement generally has been completely convinced by science, except it's a very odd conviction, and because since science is true, the Bible must be science. That's
Hmm.
what fundamentalism is about. And this, again, relating to my book, is the loss of humanism. It happens because you do not see religion as a humanist value, not a factual value,
Hmm.
but part of the humanities. And I think that's a tremendous misunderstanding, but also a tremendous injury to the value that religion can have. So, to the value of religiousness, as I put
Yeah.
it, our sense of spirituality.
Yeah. Well, and you hit on this in the book as well. You talk about, I believe it was when Kellyanne Conway had used the term alternative facts,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And that sense in which over the past 10-ish years, this notion of alternative facts and or simply screaming fake news anytime we don't like something has become the fundamentalist mantra. If science doesn't validate what we like, even though as you're trying to say, right, there's already been a concession of the idea that science is valid and true.
Right. Yeah.
But we now have to make the science work to back the authoritarianism. We can't allow the science to challenge the authoritarianism.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
so there, and but that's again, that's been part of the reality of what happens when fact, when history, when science, when these things no longer matter unless they are there to validate what the authoritarian viewpoint says, what the current authoritarian viewpoint says.
Right. And as you can see, that that structure of authority is the three-tiered universe,
Mhm.
and that is what's passing away. Like even in democracies, I know it's a difficult time now, but even in democracies, uh, compared to the past, there's a much more open format for democracy and a much more collective approach. You can see it in various political parties of transparency and a team-like attitude. Certainly here in Canada, there's this notion of Team Canada politically, that you don't just rule over other parties. You approach things together as a team, and you try to create this sort of unified and common understanding of problems and address them. And I think that's true also in the United States. It's just not in this particular government. It's a very much the three-tiered structure government
Mhm.
of the old universe. But I do think that will pass away. Uh, I think it's a last kind of effort to say we can't lose this authority. We can't lose this authority. We got to push it down hard
Mhm.
and destroy all opposition. But that never works. It never
No.
works,
Yeah. Well,
and it's
it
not the
yeah.
future.
Yeah, and people get very, even as we're seeing now, people get very quickly tired whenever they are consistently told, why everything that they, is wrong, right? So
Yeah,
these efforts to co-opt school boards to get into national positions in order to then say, and we are going to strip your freedoms based on whatever fear mongering can be done at the time. So most recently, it's predominantly been LGBTI people, right? That's been a heavy target. We're going after the LGBTI people. They're coming for your kids. They're going into schools. They're going to try to destroy your kids. They're going to make your kids gay, right? You can somehow catch gay like it's the
right.
flu. This is the kind of stuff we're dealing with in the
Yeah.
United States.
And that is an important point. Like it's because authority depends on fear, and that
Yep.
is a link that has to be broken. And that's another kind of death of God element. This old idea that being afraid means we need to find a overpowering heroic figure who will protect us. That's God the Father
Yeah.
approach.
Leviathan.
Yes, Leviathan.
Yeah. Thomas Hobbes, the
Thomas
sovereign.
Hobbes again. Yes.
Yes. So you have this, I like this quote. In religion, God is never the problem because, as with Job's friends, the believer is at fault. In religion, the thinking is that if you believe in God but lose, then you did not really believe in God in the first place.
Yeah.
Hit on that for a little bit because you're touching on something really powerful there.
Yeah, thank you. That's the tragedy of religion without humanism, because the humanism element of religion should want to move to compassion when people suffer. But when you have the three-tiered structure and authority, then suffering becomes the fault of the sufferer. What
Mhm.
did you do wrong? And that's the story of Job. These three friends visited him, and they all have the idea that he's done something wrong. And they try to explain it, and he constantly says he's innocent. And even God's explanation at the end of the book of Job is a very poor explanation. You have to say God is wrong too in the end.
Mhm.
Because in that interesting, and this is an ancient book. So here again is an example of humanism operating in religion in antiquity. In that book, you end up only with Job. The only righteous person is Job, the one who suffered. And everyone who dismisses his suffering or tries to blame him or tries to explain it is portrayed as a very empty, kind of false person. And in the
Hmm.
end, even God, doing all this God language, is kind of like talking over Job and not really holding compassion,
Hmm.
and wants Job to recognize God. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Like, give me, who are you? Who do you think that you can question me? And this again is like this blaming of the victim. So the notion of returning humanism is that religion moves to its let me say rightful place, which is compassion.
Hmm.
And the Job story is a brilliant expose of religion gone tragically wrong, where you cannot cultivate compassion for a suffering individual. Instead, you have to figure out why they didn't believe strong enough, why they fell short in their glorification of God, or what sin they committed, or their failure in some way. You look at again, I mean, I don't want to harp on it, but in fundamentalist Christianity, which is partly what I had to study a bit to write this book, you do get this language of blame on people who
Hmm.
do not believe the same way. And it's as if the book of Job has never been read, which is part of my argument that fundamentalist Christians don't read the Bible. If they read it, they would see some of this stuff, but they seem not to. So anyway, I call that the tragedy of religion. At least I'm calling that the tragedy of religion in this interview. I don't know if I say that specifically, but that's what that line is about.
Hmm. No, and I mean but it's so prevalent. This because this is something I talk to my students a little bit about when we're discussing the transition from a polytheistic world to a monotheistic world. When you're dealing with polytheism, you still have the issue of what does it mean to have all these gods? But if you want to explain why different tragedies are happening, it's kind of like with the Iliad or the Aeneid. It's because you've got competing gods, right? So Juno is trying to keep, Aeneas from doing something. Jupiter feels differently, or whatever the situation is, right? When you're in monotheism, well, the buck stops with the one true God. So through time, what has had to come into place? You've had to invent things like sin nature, or you had the evolution of Satan, where Satan goes from being sort of this kind of automaton who comes into the presence of Yahweh to this all present malevolent figure, right? Who is apparently not just causing all the world's evils, but popping people's tires as well. Oh, the devil got me again, right? I had a flat tire this morning.
Yeah,
And seeing this ways in which, or like you said, the disobedience route, which of course comes up a lot in the Bible, which why did Israel, if Yahweh is so powerful, why did Israel fall to Assyria or Babylon? Well, it just had to be their disobedience.
yes.
So there,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
finding,
you can look at, just to interrupt slightly, you can
no,
look
you're
at
good.
and Ecclesiastes as, and Ruth, the book of Ruth, as these kind of counter theologies to the dominant Deuteronomic theology of righteousness and suffering, the cycle that if you suffer, it's because you weren't righteous.
Hmm.
And these books, these wisdom books, which you can relate to Jesus, because Jesus is a wisdom figure, really counter that argument.
Hmm. Yeah.
So even within Judaism, ancient Judaism, there's this sort of internal argument of a theological argument, let's say, or dispute over what are you doing with our tradition, and what are you implying? And
Hmm.
it's all wrapped up in the authoritarian version of God. God is the army general,
Yes.
which is kind of like the Deuteronomic history, versus God as the heart of compassion and the question raiser, which you
Yeah.
find totally in the wisdom
Mhm.
tradition.
And that has spilled over in that authoritarianism to the modern world, where essentially, if you look at something like Israel genociding the Canaanites, as the story goes, God is the hammer and the Israelites are the nails, right? And
Mm.
now that's carried over into this current world, which is that God is the Republican Party. And those elected officials are the nails to bring his authority. And if the people are not going to willingly accept what God now has in store, because apparently God did a whole switch around and now he wants a democracy, but it's a democracy rooted in Western Christian notions as opposed to all of that stuff from the past. That's a different area. But if you're not going to willingly accept it, we will use the sword of government to force you to accept it.
Yes, and I think even you could say that this new God of Christian nationalism is not a democratic God
No.
at all. It's really an anti-constitutional
Mhm.
move, and I think it's incredible that the Republican Party in its modern expression is essentially against the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah.
That's hard to
Yes.
believe, but that's
Yes.
what's
It's so long as the U.S. Constitution is, does not favor areas that they like or dislike, right? That's the key to it. Is
yes,
it has to be constitutional if they feel it runs against them, right? So if it's freedom of religion, you better not touch that. But if it's issues pertaining to something like, oh, the rights and freedoms of LGBTI people, well, they're sinners. They don't
yes.
they don't get the same freedoms we do.
Well, I think, from what I can tell in the rise of Christian nationalism, freedom of religion means freedom to be a Christian of some denomination
Yes.
or another.
Yes.
But it doesn't mean you're free to be another religion, of another religion, or non-religious.
Hmm.
It's
Yes.
very tricky. It's a slippery slope.
Yes.
And
Yes.
once you go down it, then eventually you're going to say, well, there's not just freedom of religion for Christians, but only for specific kinds of Christians. That'll be the next.
Yes. Yeah.
And well, it's the normal
100%.
part,
Yeah.
all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others.
Yeah. And that's something that people don't get as well is and thinking about this idea that, no, when Christians can finally take over, things are going to be better. No, there always has to be an enemy. When Protestants and Catholics were in Europe, was it just a big kumbaya fest? No, right? They fought, they battled, they went through horrible, bloody affairs because it's who is the proper Christian.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And if
right. It's
yeah.
basically the 30 Years' War. I mean, you get
Yeah.
mixed up with other things, but that's it, like
Yeah.
how do you solve the problem of plurality within Christianity?
Hmm.
And the answer to that question was somebody's got to win.
Absolutely. It has to be a winner.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it goes back to that same sense of authoritarianism, which is that
Yeah. And
there's always going to be there's always going to be something going wrong, which means you always have to have fear to explain why God's angry, and there always has to be someone to blame for that.
yeah, and it's unfortunate, and this is why you need, again, humanism in religion, because you need the critical capacity of studies, humanities studies, uh, when you read the Bible. And without that, you have to say, yes, in the Bible, there is God, the war general. It's there. But if you don't have any critical awareness of the plurality within the Bible itself, you don't have a way to measure and balance. And secondly, you're lacking the historical context, which once again is the three-tiered universe context, and the development and growth of Judaism and Christianity, and then the sources. Source criticism would come into play. Like, what are the sources for that image, and what are they competing with? There's lots to gain in a sort of religiousness sense, and that is to say, having a broader, more open heart and a broader and more informed mind if you allow humanist, critical, historical study to be informing the sense and the meaning of religion and its future with us. And that's what we run the risk of not having that at all. which means that you raise the question of the future of religion. This is why it's dying. It's not offering these things
Hmm.
popularly. And so you end up with this dichotomy, kind of like crazy religion trying to be science versus actual science that is leading us to new insights and new technologies.
Can't have people thinking too much, David. We can't do that. All right, so we're going to jump into a dangerous topic. In
Okay.
fact, uttering the very word Christian nationalist Jesus may strike me dead here.
Oh boy.
The danger of the word socialism, because you mention socialism in the book. So here's a question. What is the social gospel?
Yeah. Well, it's a good thing we're having a conversation because the answer to that question is a conversation.
Hmm.
Um, in a in a general sense, the social gospel was the emphasis of what of ethics in the Christian tradition. Let's say it starts there. And it probably is correct to say that it emerges with the problems that come with capitalism. That is to say, the problems of extreme wealth and poverty. And the basic message of the gospel and the witness even of Jesus, whether you are talking about the historical Jesus or the Jesus of Christian faith, who speaks to the poor. How happy are the poor? How blessed are the poor? And who has parables where there's impoverished people acting out, like the widow, the impoverished widow who is begging from an overlord type of figure, or the Good Samaritan where there's someone caring for someone beaten and discarded at the side of the road. Those are these different images of turn the other cheek, go the second mile. These different images of Jesus relating to compassion and care for the poor. And in the social gospel, it's about the ethics of Christianity. How does Christianity play out in society? It's not just about how do I get saved. In fact, the meaning of the gospel, the kingdom of God, as it was translated in the early 20th century, I would say the empire of God, because I think Jesus was playing with the image of the empire of Rome and was offering this alternative empire, so to speak, to what was happening in his lifetime. But if we go with the traditional language, the kingdom of God is not about individuals. It's about a reality, a different way of life. And it is based on an ethic of compassion. So it's really a requirement of the individual to be compassionate. That's the start of the social gospel, not to be interested in selfishness, but interested in giving for the other. Well, how do you interpret the crucifixion in the social gospel? The crucifixion is the act of giving your life, laying down your life for the other. So these things are highly traditional in Christianity, but they come out in social gospel, social concern, socialism. What is that? That is the distribution of wealth. So there is not an extreme extremity between high high end wealth and extreme poverty. It means the distribution of wealth means everybody gets a chance to have an education and a chance to advance their life. Education is a common good. It's a collective good. Healthcare, it shouldn't be that you can buy healthcare. And if you're impoverished or you struggle, you don't get it. These are injustices. So the gospel is about in the when you focus on the ethic of the gospel, it's about equality, it's about sharing. Now, how do you make that happen in capitalism? Well, you make it happen with a social form of capitalism. There'll still be rich people and poor people, but there'll never be anybody without health care, never be anybody without a chance to get an education, never be anybody without food or clothing or shelter. These are basic, fundamental things that all human beings deserve, and all human beings deserve that because we are all in it together. There's the social part. So people relate socialism to communism and to the old Soviet Union and think that it's about dictatorship, but socialism is not that. It's about sharing and it's highly flexible. So you have different kinds of socialism. And one of the kinds of socialism is social democracy that works really well. And several European nations are examples for us to look at something that works really well. You still have lots of millionaires, for example, in Sweden. There's lots of wealthy people and probably billionaires, but I know Sweden, I think it has the highest per capita number of millionaires, if I'm not mistaken, in the Western tradition. But everybody gets health care, everybody gets education. There's nobody starving. People are housed. If you're old and retiring, the best place to retire in the world, especially if you need care in your older years, definitely the best place is Sweden. We'd like to be in Sweden for that. And this is not destructive of society, and it's not a threat, and it does not affect anybody's freedom. It's just an expression of our care or compassion or concern or connection, our sociology, our socialness as human beings. And to argue against the social gospel is to somehow be afraid that there's a loss of freedom, I think. The
Mhm.
fear mongering about socialism is incredible. And it's hard for me to know where that comes from, but it's certainly not fear about democratic forms of social capitalism. It's fear about some made up monster that's going to take away everything you have.
Sure.
And that does not happen. And ironically, a lot of Americans go to Europe. They visit Denmark and Sweden and Finland and Germany and France, and they come home and they say, "Well, why can't we have this? Why can't we have that?" I mean, this is what they see it. They're like, "Why can't we have streets, walkable streets, and these nice and the infrastructure to travel around? Why isn't that there? I just went there and I could go anywhere. It was so easy. Like, why can't we do that here?" I mean, you hear that often. Or my children go to Europe for an education because they can afford it in Europe, and they can't afford it in America. I mean, it's crazy. Like all the evidence is all around us that this social democracy, social gospel idea is very good and very constructive and very enabling of our freedom. But we do the fear approach again.
Hmm.
And this is the dominant metaphor right now going on in unfortunately, I would say in America and in Canada too.
Hmm.
The fear, the emphasis on fear. You got to be afraid of things and you need an authority. And, anything that contradicts that is somehow demonic or in some way totally, totally to be despised,
Hmm.
rejected,
Hmm.
threatening, totally threatening.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's socialism. Socialism will kill you. It will take everything away from you,
Yeah.
as opposed to in the capitalist system, where even though the fact that you are already poor and you're struggling, you'll have somehow even less under socialism. And it goes to these myths that as people living in the United States were taught growing up that your hard work translates into wealth. So once again, it's the blaming the victim, right? Despite the fact that we all know, at the very root of our being, that one does not work hard, because and I ask this to people all the time, even people who are conservative. Are you independently wealthy? Because I don't think you are. So you're saying you didn't work hard throughout your life. And no one will cop to that, right? But if this idea is that capitalism as we know it in the United States is that you work hard and you are rewarded with proportionate wealth, that means if you are still struggling as you get older to make ends meet, you did not work hard. Right. And for many people, that is the myth they perpetuate while simultaneously struggling to make ends meet. So what was your failure to work hard? Where did that emanate from? And of course they would all say they worked hard. Right? It's again, it's these sound bites that people buy into. Right? If we allow for socialism, we're going to have 10% of the population working hard so that 90% can just be slackasses, right? That's
Yeah,
that
that
that's
that
that's what
does
they
not
say.
happen. I mean, again, it
Yeah.
depends on what kind of socialism you're talking about. But if
Hmm.
you're talking about a democratic form of socialism within the capitalist system, that does not happen.
Yeah.
And in fact, quite the opposite. I think Timothy Snyder in on Freedom makes the strong point that certain democratic institutions that we normally call socialism, such as healthcare, for example, socialized healthcare, enable enable freedom.
Hmm.
I mean, think about it. You don't have to worry about your health. It enables you to go out and be creative with your life and productive. You don't have to worry that if you get sick, you're going to have to mortgage your house or something to pay a bill that you can't possibly afford.
Yep.
Uh, you, so you have an enabling of your life, and it's the same with transportation. You have public transportation. You don't have to worry about not being able to afford to get to your place of work. You can go there, and you can be productive, and you can earn your paycheck. Nobody's saying you don't have, don't work, and nobody's saying uh, don't have dreams and don't be productive. It's all about ensuring that we're not creating situations where people are destroyed in capitalism.
Yeah.
And the billionaires, multi-billionaires gain at the expense of the suffering of the common person. That's totally ridiculous. That is not society. And I don't know how to make that point in such a way that it gets realized. But I'm going to
Hmm.
just touch on something else. But I think some of the politicians now, the leaders in the United States, are making this connection very strongly because it's so evident socially right at the moment.
Hmm.
But the other thing is, you got to remember Thomas Jefferson, this is based on John Locke, really emphasized democracy and education, that you need public education to have democracy because you need a common ability to debate. And you can't have that if people are not getting the common education. So private education also destroys democracy. You need public education because we all want to have the ability to debate with one another, which means we all need to have a language we can
Hmm.
use in the democratic structures. And those education also enables. It shouldn't be that you have to go into debt just to enable yourself to find the kind of job you want to find or to be productive. Education is a common good. So healthcare is a common good, education is a common good, infrastructure is a common good, justice is a common good. There's lots of these different forms of common good. There's six forms specifically, which I sometimes remember and sometimes not. But nevertheless, they enable our freedom, justice and social welfare. Like that's another common good. It's not people being lazy. It's people losing their job and being desperate. And society says, we're going to enable you to recover and get back in the game. We're going to make sure you don't starve when you've lost your job. We're going to make sure you don't lose your house when you've lost your job. We're going to make
Hmm.
sure that you can't get education if you've lost your job. We're enabling you to get back in the game. That's social welfare. That's social gospel.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And spot on. I mean, I think it seems so obvious, spot on. But I have before called the wealthy and powerful of the United States the new gods, and that's really what it comes down to as I see this issue. Because what do we see every time the idea of increased wages comes up? Prices will go up. If we give people a livable wage, prices will go up because corporations need their profits. In other words, that's the new gods. If we do not appease the gods, which is the wealthy and powerful, they will raise our prices. And so you have poor people who actively campaign against themselves, making better money and being able to live because they are afraid of angering the gods. And if we anger those gods, they're going to punish us with higher prices. So I will continue to subsistently live. I will work 3 or 4 or 5 jobs. I will be constantly exhausted because somehow, if I do that, eventually the new gods will give me a better job, and I will have earned my way to a sustainable future through that. If I just grind it out and I live as a peasant for long enough, I will be rewarded. Right? It's like a weird dystopian Logan's Run kind of scenario where if we just hang on and if we just continue to appease the gods, they will do that. And unfortunately, I mean, you saw during our election, right? One of the wealthiest men in the world spent just unbelievable amounts of money to make sure that Donald Trump got elected. And then basically was just given this whole new branch of a government. Okay, we're just going to create this Doge thing just for you. And then, of course, their egos collide and they fall out. And now he's no longer a part of it, right? Like, but that's the thing is that the new gods can buy whatever they want. They can buy power, they can buy wealth, and they have completely convinced people who have nothing that even if they want a little bit more than nothing, they will be punished for that.
That's a very good analogy, Chad. I think you could say, yeah, we still are pushing this three-tiered universe structure
Hmm.
in a polytheistic way. We have all these
Hmm.
gods at the top,
Yep.
and kind of have our fate in their hands. And
Hmm.
if we upset them, we're going to get punished. That's really remarkable. But there's you using religious themes and language in a humanistic way.
Hmm.
And that's the insight of religiousness that you just exemplified right there.
It's because I read your book. I know, so that's what it was, right? It all came together because I read the book. So you too can have this breakthrough. You hit something really important because it goes to the heart of Westar. Westar is about education. Westar is about bringing religious literacy to the public. Westar is fueled by scholars such as yourself and myself and so many others. But we are not doing the academic thing, which is we write books for one another, right? We're not doing all of this to impress other scholars and to root it in scholaries and all this stuff. It's about bringing this critical insight to the public. And first of all, Westar from the beginning angered people. Fundamentalists have been long angered by the fact that Westar didn't keep those critical thoughts within the academy. They didn't just keep it in college, they brought it to the public. And the response was, how dare you, from the fundamentalist world. To touch on what you've hit here with the economics, who do we currently see belittling education? Billionaires, the wealthy and the powerful, as well as the authoritarian Christian world. All of them are trying to co-opt and essentially create distrust in education because they do not want a society that knows how to critically think and analyze these subjects. They want us complacent and obedient and poor and plugging along so that we are always dependent on the new gods.
Yeah. So there's this again, this element of fear that if you allow, which is again, I've probably said this a few times, kind of unbelievable to me, but if you allow people the capacity to hold their own integrity, to think critically for themselves, to find the way they want to plug into the economy and develop their lives and affirm their dreams. That's all through education. You find the way to do that. That's somehow threatening to the one who is in charge.
Yep.
You can't have people doing that. You need people dependent on you and your ideology and the system that makes you money. So th- a total distortion of the Christian gospel
Hmm.
is being played out in these forms where we have the polytheistic gods of the billionaire club basically trying to stay in the position of authority and creating dependency on them.
Hmm.
That's the opposite of the Christian gospel. So here, that's why the social gospel is so important because it's the critique of that false religion or that false Christianity.
Hmm. For those of you who maybe have not joined us before, this is the reason why David Galston is the executive director of West Star. So he's a tremendous leader. He's got great insights for us, and as you can see, there's a vision of something bigger than just what we have known, right? And one of the reasons why looking at how Christianity has continued to fall off in the modern world is it's very difficult for people to accept this basic sense of medieval and or ancient authoritarianism whenever there is no critical thought or reproach allowed, which the authoritarian model of Christianity has never been big on allowing for critical thinking. We establish orthodoxy. If you don't buy this, you're a heretic and you're out. That's the model. So,
essentially. But it's interesting because we have to remember, and this is one of the strange things, like Christianity is really pluralistic,
mhm,
and authoritarian Christianity doesn't like pluralism.
does not.
But when you highlight certain figures of history, you can see that Christianity has many different voices.
Mhm,
And, I think of Thomas Aquinas is like kind of a medieval naturalist because he sees the creation moving toward its, what he called its blessedness. But it can do that because it is good, because it knows its goodness. It knows that it's created and God called it good, so therefore it moves toward the blessing, the goodness of God. I mean, that's an incredible theology. It's a
mhm,
medieval theology. It still has a God up in the sky kind of thing, but it's got an amazing natural, sort of an amazing naturalism to it that you can recover if you have the sense of religiousness. But if you don't have that sense, the sense of humanism in religion, if you don't have that sense, you're going to look at somebody like Aquinas, who's the angelic doctor of the church, and you'll just look at the authority. God is
mhm,
up there above in heaven directing things, and God is like I say, the general overwatching things, and is going to punish you if you're wrong. And that's very sad for Aquinas, because that's not Aquinas' God, but he can give himself to that because he's living in the Middle Ages. And that's very sad for the church because we lose an element of humanism in our story, an element of naturalism. That's evil today. Well, you're a
mhm.
naturalist, or an element of almost because the fear is you're going to worship nature, as a false god. You're going to be an idol worshiper. But no, it's really a naturalism, a love of nature that is there in the Christian tradition. It's just that it's in the sort of in the pluralism of Christianity and often hidden from
Mhm.
view because of the obsession with authority
Yeah.
and the desire to, driven by fear, to condemn heretics.
Yeah. And part of the fear campaign as well is that from that authoritarian perspective, everyone by virtue of this worldview is worshiping something. So if you are not worshiping our God, you are
Yeah.
worshiping yourself, right? It's that sense of you have made yourself God by virtue of the fact that you will not do things the way that you should do them, that we think you should do them, even though it's all based on human tradition, right? It goes back to it's kind of like, I don't know if you've ever seen this meme. It's like a truck on a railroad ties, and it's like your opinion, and then it shows a train blasting through, and it says scripture.
Oh,
And yeah, and I love that because it's so just bizarre. Scripture is an opinion. Right? There's not one canon of scripture of Christian scripture in existence. And even so, it never fell from heaven. It was quite literally the decision of human beings who had an opinion on what scripture was.
yes. Yeah.
But yeah, people don't think about that.
No. And that's also, again, that moves us close to the death of God because I think in the broader sense of culture, that sort of authoritarianism is just passing away. It
Mhm.
has a kind of a heightened expression right at the moment, but it's not a lasting one. Uh, so because it has no future, right?
Yeah.
It has no future.
Yeah.
So for a slight analogy, there isn't really a future with oil and gas. I think we know that. And the technologies around renewable energy are employing more people than oil and gas employs.
Mhm.
And secondly, uh, clean energy, they're not destroying the planet, and they use our creativity to imagine a new future. So there's all kinds of elements going around clean energy that are no longer present, that are dying in oil and gas, but somehow we still want to emphasize that and almost heighten it, but it can't last. And that's what's happening with God. We try to heighten God and make God the authority and what cannot change and what cannot be moved. But in fact, all the energy around human spirituality is in light of the death of God. It's a new energy. It's like renewable spirituality, if you like.
Mhm. Love that.
Yeah,
So the book is Restoring Humanism to Religion by
yeah.
David Galston. It's available on Amazon, it's available on Barnes and Noble, or you can go to the Westar Institute's store and you can get it there. There is, if you're an audiobook type person, there is the like AI audiobook version that's available on Amazon as well. So it will it'll hit hit all the core points and everything. It may not be David's lovely voice, but it will be a voice that you can just listen to if you're just interested in listening. But it's a fascinating book, something that generates discussion and will hopefully get people thinking as these methods of authoritarianism continue to fall flat with folks who realize this isn't all it was cracked up to be. David, thank you so much for your time this morning. It's been lovely as always.
Thank you, Chad. It's always great talking with you. I really enjoy it. So I hope uh, future podcasts with others will be equally rewarding for your audience. And for me, it's just a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much. David Galston, our executive director, thank you so much for joining us on Bible Search and Rescue. We're going to start a new series of podcasts coming up at Bible Search and Rescue. We're going to do Bible Search and Rescue Goes to the Movies. So we're going to have some interesting guests for that. We're going to have some good topics. Until next time, I'm Chad Venners, your host. Please take care, everybody, and go out and make the world a better place for somebody else today. Goodbye.